to yet another video of Tiny House Big Project. So today we're going to talk about if you want to build a trailer but you don't want the skeleton or the frame to be made out of wood, you can make it out of metal. So what are the advantages and what are the disadvantages of building with steel? Let's talk about that. The biggest difference between building your tiny house frame with steel instead of with wood is that you have to outsource the build of your structure, because if you really want to build your frame out of steel and you're not a professional welder, because not many people are a professional welder, you will have to let a company make your steel frame, and that will cost a bit of extra money. But I myself am not a professional welder. I've never welded in my life. Welding takes years to practice, so unless you are a professional welder, I really recommend to outsource the build of your tiny house structure if you want to build with steel and you're not a professional welder. Because I don't know nothing about welding, I can't really help you today with how you should weld your tiny house. I'm not gonna talk about how. I'm gonna talk about the pros and the cons, the advantages and the disadvantages of building your tiny house of steel. So here we go. Let's start with the pros. The first pro of building your tiny house of steel is the weight. Building with steel is lighter than building with wood. That's because wooden beams are solid, whereas steel beams are hollow from the inside. So if you have a steel frame, it's lighter. And that means that if you build a tiny house on wheels, you also have to spend less money on fuel, because a lighter tiny house costs less fuel to pull than a heavier tiny house. So if you want to make your tiny house as light as possible, I advise using steel instead of wood. Steel is also stronger than wood. So if you build your tiny house out of steel instead of out of wood, it is stronger, so it's less likely to collapse. Not that a tiny house made of wood with a wooden structure is likely to collapse, it's just steel is even more durable and even more sturdy than wood. If you calculate this, steel is 10 times stronger than wood. And if you take the weight into account, so steel is also lighter, it's even 25 times as strong. So steel is significantly stronger than building with wood. Steel is, if you treat it properly, it's fire resistant. Steel from itself is not completely fire resistant. If it gets exposed to really high temperatures, it can melt, it can bend. So it's not completely fireproof, but it's easier to make steel fireproof than wood, because wood just burns. And if you treat your steel with the right chemicals, the right paints, you can make steel more or less fireproof. So if you have a fire in your tiny house and it's made of steel, the chance of it spreading are smaller than if you build your tiny house structure out of wood. So if you want to make your house extra fireproof, I advise going with steel, because that's easier to make fireproof than wood. Number 4, and my last pro for today, is pests. If you build of steel, you have less chance of difficulty with pests, because whereas worms and other pests like to eat wood, they don't like steel. Snobs that they are, they only eat wood. Because if you make wood, your tiny house is in danger of being eaten by pests, which will, in the worst events, cause it to collapse, which is dangerous. So if you do it correctly, and if you close your walls and everything correctly, there shouldn't be any pests that can get into your wall and can get into your frame. But if you want to be extra sure, you can build it of metal or of steel, and that way pests definitely won't eat your tiny house. I have listed a couple of pros today. These are the major pros, the pros that I thought, well, these are big pros that you should think of when deciding whether you want to build a steel or a wooden frame for your tiny house. But now let's talk about the cons, because there are some cons about building with steel. So let's discuss these first so you can make an educated decision. The biggest disadvantage or the biggest con of building your tiny house structure with steel for me is that steel isn't known for its insulation. So if you build with steel, you have to make sure that your house is really well insulated, because warmth will just go right through steel. Well, with wood, wood is a better insulator than steel. So for me, I thought that was a really big con because I get cold pretty quickly. So if I want to build a tiny house, I want to know it will be warm. The second con, if you build with steel, you have to think about a lot of things in advance before building your tiny house, because changing tiny little things in your steel frame is a lot more difficult than changing little things when you build with wood. For example, wood you can just use in your workplace. If you suddenly decide you want to build your window on another side of the house, it's easier to make that change if you build with wood than with steel, because like I said before, you need to outsource the build of your tiny house structure if you work with steel, and it's a lot harder to make these last minute decisions if you build with steel. Also, if you build a steel frame, you need to know where the windows will be, where the outlets will be, where the doors will be, all before building your tiny house. And you have to send that to a company that can build your tiny house frame, and then you get that frame back delivered to you. And if you decide halfway, well, no, I don't want this anymore, I want to change, it's a lot more difficult and it will cost you more money than if you just build with wood. Number 3, corrosion. If you build with steel or with any sort of metal, you need to take into account that steel and metal can rust. And rust damages the integrity of your house. So if you build with steel, if you build with metal, you need to make sure that your steel is rust free, that it's galvanized steel, for example, that you work with, or that you put the right coating on your steel so that it is rust free and you don't get any problem of rust forming. So corrosion is basically the pests of steel. So where pests are a big problem with wood, you have corrosion, a big problem with steel. So it weighs itself out, I think. And the last con I want to talk about today is electricity. Electricity really likes metal, really likes steel, and steel is a very good conductor for electricity. So if your wires of your electrical come into contact with your steel frame, it can be really dangerous because the electricity thinks, oh my god, steel, I like steel, let's go through there, which can cause fires in your tiny house. So if you build with steel, you have to make sure that their wires don't come in contact with your steel frame, because that can be very, very dangerous. So these were my things that I were the biggest pros and the biggest cons of building a steel frame. If you know any more, feel free to leave them in the comments below, and maybe you can help someone else out. Of course, building with wood also has its advantages and disadvantages. And if you want to see more about that, you can click on this link. I think it's in this corner. You can click on this link and that will take you to my video of building your tiny house structure with wood. I hope this video helped some people. If it did, and if you like to see more about tiny houses and the things that go into building a tiny house, please make sure to subscribe, like, and click on that little notification bell to be the first to know when I post my next video. For now, I hope you have a nice day, and I see you later.